In 1989, a couple on Long Island took a gamble on an abandoned storage unit. They couldn't see exactly what was inside. They didn't know who had rented it, and they didn't know why somebody had paid to keep its contents stored away for 10 years, only to apparently abandon everything inside. The winning bid has commonly been reported as about $100. Then they opened the door. Underneath a pile of blankets was something white, low, wide, and unmistakably exotic. It looked like a sports car. The couple had absolutely no idea what they'd just found, but other people did. And eventually, complete strangers would begin recognizing this mysterious machine. Years later, it would be offered at one of the world's most prestigious collector car auctions. It would sell for £616,000, including the buyer's premium. And the person who bought it would turn out to be one of the most famous billionaires on earth, but neither of those things is the biggest surprise in this story. Because there's one fact about what was sitting underneath those blankets that I'm deliberately not telling you yet. And when we get to it at the end, you'll understand why this particular machine was so unusual, why it had disappeared for an entire decade, and why the billionaire who eventually bought it had wanted something like it since he was a child. For now, here's your only clue. When that storage unit door opened in 1989, virtually everything the couple initially assumed about what they were looking at was wrong. To understand why, we have to go back 12 years to 1977 and to a movie production that wanted a sports car to do something no normal sports car could possibly do. By the mid 1970s, Lotus had created one of the most futuristic looking sports cars in the world, the Lotus Esprit. Its basic shape came from legendary Italian designer Giorgetto Giugiaro. It was low, angular, and dramatically different from the curving sports cars that had dominated the previous decade. It looked like something James Bond should drive, and someone at Lotus apparently had the same thought. Production was underway on the next Bond movie, The Spy Who Loved Me. Rather than simply asking the filmmakers to use an Esprit, Lotus public relations manager Don McLaughlin reportedly tried something much more clever. A pre-production Esprit was parked outside the Bond production offices at Pinewood Studios, but Lotus identification was removed. People came outside. They stared at it, and they wanted to know one thing. What is that? Exactly the reaction Lotus wanted. The Esprit got the filmmakers' attention, and soon it had a starring role alongside Roger Moore. But the producers didn't want Bond simply driving another beautiful sports car. They had imagined a sequence that sounded almost impossible. Bond would be pursued along the coast. He would run out of road, and instead of stopping, he would drive his Lotus straight into the sea. That alone wasn't the impossible part. The impossible part was what they wanted to happen next. One Esprit body shell was sent to Perry Oceanographic in Florida. The assignment was bizarre. Take the shape of Lotus's futuristic sports car and make it function underwater. The result became known as Wet Nelly. It was equipped with 4 electrically powered propellers. Batteries supplied power. Ballast equipment helped control its movement through the water. Fins helped stabilize and steer it. A retired U.S. Navy SEAL named Don Griffin piloted the machine during filming, and operating it required something you certainly wouldn't find in a normal Lotus owner's manual: scuba equipment. The underwater scenes were filmed in the Bahamas. Even some of the bubbles seen trailing the machine were reportedly enhanced using Alka-Seltzer tablets. On screen, however, the illusion was remarkably convincing. Bond drove a Lotus into the water, and the same Lotus appeared to continue beneath the sea. Audiences weren't supposed to think about how many different machines were actually involved. They were supposed to see one car, and that's important, because 12 years later, when that couple pulled the blankets away inside a Long Island storage unit, they were about to fall for essentially the same illusion. The Spy Who Loved Me became one of the most successful Bond films of its era, and the White Lotus became an icon. Wet Nelly was valuable as a promotional object. It appeared publicly. People photographed it, fans recognized it, and then something strange happened. It disappeared from public view. Eventually, the underwater machine was placed inside a storage unit in Holbrook, Long Island. The lease was reportedly paid 10 years in advance. Then the door closed, and Wet Nelly sat there. Think about what was happening outside that storage unit. Roger Moore made more Bond movies. The Lotus Esprit became increasingly recognizable. The Spy Who Loved Me continued appearing on television and home video. A new generation saw the famous sequence. Meanwhile, one of the actual machines responsible for creating it was sitting behind an ordinary storage door. 1 year passed, then another, then 5, then 10. The prepaid lease expired, and apparently, nobody came to collect what was inside. Eventually, the abandoned contents were put up for auction. The bidders weren't being offered a famous James Bond artifact. As far as they knew, they were bidding on the contents of an old storage unit. One couple won. Then the door opened, and they saw the blankets. Underneath them was that strange white shape. And remember the promise from the beginning. What they thought they were looking at wasn't actually what they had found. The couple hadn't bought the locker because they were James Bond collectors. According to accounts of the discovery, they hadn't even seen The Spy Who Loved Me, so the significance of the strange white machine wasn't immediately obvious. But eventually, it had to be transported. And that's when things became interesting. Other motorists began noticing it. Truck drivers reportedly started talking about it over CB radio. People recognized the shape, because millions of people had already seen something that looked exactly like it. On a movie screen. The possibility became impossible to ignore. Could this actually be connected to James Bond? Eventually, experts examined it, and the answer was extraordinary. Yes, this was Wet Nelly, the underwater machine used during the famous Lotus sequence in The Spy Who Loved Me. The couple had accidentally acquired an authentic piece of movie history. At this point, you might think I've already given away the surprise I promised you. A couple buys an abandoned storage unit. Inside is James Bond's Lotus. That's the story, except it isn't. There's still one very important distinction between the Lotus Esprit Roger Moore appears to drive in the movie and the thing these people actually found. Hold on to that, because first, this forgotten machine was about to become extraordinarily valuable. Wet Nelly was eventually cosmetically restored. A purpose-built display trailer allowed it to be shown publicly. It appeared at exhibitions, including at the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles. But for years, there was no public auction establishing exactly what someone would pay to own it. That changed in 2013. RM Auctions announced that Wet Nelly would be offered in London. By then, its story was known. This wasn't merely something resembling the Bond Lotus. Its identity and film history had been established. Collectors knew what they were bidding on. The auction began. The price climbed. £100,000 higher, £200,000 higher, £300,000 still higher. Eventually, the hammer fell at £550,000. With buyer's premium, the final price was £616,000. At the exchange rate of the period, that was close to $1 million US. An object found forgotten beneath blankets in an abandoned storage locker had become a nearly $1 million collectible. But the buyer wasn't sitting anonymously in the auction room. The winning bidder participated by telephone, and initially, the public didn't know who it was. When the identity finally came out, the story became even stranger. Of course you'd call it a car, but look closer. There's something missing. Actually, several things. There are no wheels. There is no normal Lotus engine. Open it up and you don't find the luxurious interior Roger Moore sits inside during the movie. There's no normal passenger compartment at all. Instead, there are batteries, electric motors, propulsion equipment, ballast systems, controls designed for movement underwater, and the person operating it didn't sit behind a Lotus steering wheel dressed like James Bond. He operated it wearing scuba equipment, because the couple who opened that storage unit in 1989 hadn't discovered an abandoned Lotus Esprit. They had discovered a submarine. Wet Nelly wasn't a road-going Lotus that could somehow also travel underwater. It couldn't drive down the highway, it couldn't transform, it couldn't even roll out of the storage unit on its own wheels. It was a purpose-built underwater machine wearing the body of a Lotus Esprit. And that's why the movie illusion was so effective. The filmmakers used different vehicles to convince audiences that one extraordinary Lotus could drive on land, launch from a pier, transform, and continue underwater. The machine underneath those blankets was responsible for only the last part of that illusion, and Elon Musk knew exactly what he'd bought. But even here, the story has one final little turn. When Musk talked about buying Wet Nelly, he said something revealing. As a child, he'd been disappointed to discover that the Lotus from the movie couldn't actually transform from a road car into a submarine. The movie had fooled him too, and now he owned the machine that helped create that illusion. Musk talked about fitting it with a Tesla electric powertrain and trying to make it transform for real. Think about that. A child watches James Bond drive a Lotus into the sea. He believes, at least for a moment, that he's watching a car become a submarine. He grows up, becomes enormously wealthy, builds an electric car company, and decades later, he buys the actual underwater machine from the movie because he'd never forgotten it. And none of that might have happened if somebody hadn't stopped paying for a storage unit on Long Island. A storage unit containing an object that apparently sat untouched for 10 years. Until a couple took a gamble. They reportedly spent around $100, opened a door, pulled away some blankets, and thought they'd found a strange old sports car. They were wrong. They'd found one of the most famous submarines in movie history. And perhaps the strangest part is that the illusion created in 1977 worked twice. First on millions of people sitting inside movie theaters, and then, 12 years later, on the people who actually found the thing. If you enjoy the unbelievable true stories behind extraordinary cars, subscribe to the Rapid Vehicles YouTube channel and visit rapidvehicles.com for diecast cars, automotive collectibles, and more stories from the world of extraordinary automobiles. Because sometimes the most incredible thing about a legendary car is discovering it was never really a car at all.